The Galactic Assessment Bureau occupied 17 floors of pristine crystalline architecture in the heart of Confederation Central, where bureaucracy had been elevated to an art form and mediocrity celebrated as a virtue. Here, in climate-controlled chambers that hummed with the efficiency of 1,000 civilizations' combined administrative prowess, the fate of entire species was decided with all the gravitas of processing a parking violation. The Bureau prided itself on being the galaxy's premier institution for evaluating potential new members of the Galactic Confederation. Their brochures, available in 47,000 languages and 3 forms of interpretive dance, boasted of rigorous scientific methodology and unbiased assessment protocols. What they failed to mention was that their idea of rigorous methodology involved roughly the same level of creativity as a particularly uninspired cafeteria menu, and their unbiased protocols had all the flexibility of crystallized bureaucratic cement. In Assessment Chamber 7 Alpha, the lead evaluator reviewed her morning schedule with the enthusiasm typically reserved for root canal procedures. Her species had evolved past the need for names, finding them inefficient, though the humans she was about to assess would probably have called her something unpronounceable, involving clicking sounds and what resembled aggressive throat clearing. She had been conducting these evaluations for the better part of 3 decades, which in Galactic Standard Time was roughly equivalent to watching paint dry on a planetary scale. The evaluation process itself was a marvel of standardized mediocrity. Species were tested across various parameters including technological advancement, social cohesion, and most importantly, their ability to participate in what the Bureau euphemistically called controlled conflict resolution scenario. Translation: they threw civilizations into a digital meat grinder and observed how spectacularly they failed to cooperate with anyone, including themselves. She pulled up the day's assessment file, noting with practiced indifference that today's subject was listed as species 7804b Sol System 3rd planet, self-designation human. The classification tag read primitive bipeds, standard protocol recommended, which in Bureau terminology meant they expected this to be over before her morning stimulant beverage grew cold. The preliminary data made for depressing reading, though depression implied she still possessed the capacity for emotional investment in these proceedings. Humans had achieved basic spaceflight, developed primitive nuclear technology, and demonstrated all the political sophistication of a particularly argumentative school of fish. Their planetary communications networks buzzed with constant disagreement about everything from resource distribution to the optimal method for preparing edible plant matter. The species appeared to have elevated arguing to a cultural cornerstone, perfect candidates for standard assessment protocol. In other words, she initiated the simulation chamber, watching as holographic displays materialized around her workstation like digital flowers blooming in fast-forward. The standard moderate threat scenario loaded with bureaucratic precision, a resource-scarce environment featuring territorial disputes, competing factions, and escalating tension. The Bureau had refined this particular test over millennia, calibrating it to produce reliable failure rates across diverse species types. The scenario placed test subjects in a closed system with limited access to essential resources, forcing them to negotiate, compete, or collaborate for survival. Most species chose violence within the first few simulation cycles, providing clear justification for membership denial. Those rare few who attempted cooperation typically collapsed into factional infighting shortly thereafter, proving equally unsuitable for Confederation membership. The beauty of the system from the Bureau's perspective was its elegant simplicity. Species either demonstrated they were too aggressive for peaceful coexistence, or too fragmented to maintain stable governance. Either way, the paperwork was straightforward, and she could move on to the next assessment with minimal cognitive investment. She glanced at the human behavioral profiles again, noting their documented history of tribal conflicts, resource wars, and an apparent genetic predisposition toward territorial marking that would have impressed even the most obsessive spacefaring mammal. Their technological development showed classic signs of a species that had discovered how to split atoms before figuring out how to split dinner bills fairly. The simulation parameters loaded automatically, 12 human settlements scattered across a resource-limited environment, each group possessing different technological capabilities and cultural background. Limited food production capabilities, scarce mineral deposits, and environmental pressures that would escalate over the course of the assessment period. The scenario had been specifically designed to trigger competitive behaviors and highlight species-level incompatibility. She settled back in her evaluation chair, already mentally composing the standard rejection report. The humans would probably start fighting within the first few cycles, possibly over something as trivial as territorial boundaries or resource allocation method. The simulation would conclude with either mutual annihilation or the emergence of a single dominant faction that had eliminated all competition, either outcome providing clear evidence of unsuitability for Confederation membership. The morning stimulant beverage arrived via automated delivery, still steaming with optimal temperature regulation. She took a sip and prepared to witness another routine demonstration of why most species remained confined to their home systems, forever excluded from the galactic community by their own predictable limitations. After all, how different could these humans possibly be? Part 2. The simulation begins. The simulation materialized with the quiet efficiency of a well-oiled administrative machine, projecting 12 human settlements across a holographic landscape that sparkled with deceptive beauty. Each community appeared as a cluster of primitive structures surrounded by agricultural plots that looked optimistically inadequate for long-term survival. The assessor activated her monitoring protocols and prepared to document another predictable descent into chaos. The humans themselves proved immediately fascinating in their ordinariness. They possessed the standard bipedal configuration, opposable thumbs, and oversized craniums that suggested intelligence without guaranteeing wisdom. Their settlements reflected typical early-stage civilizational development, basic tool usage, rudimentary social organization, and technology that would have impressed their ancestors while remaining laughably primitive by galactic standards. She began filling out the preliminary assessment forms, checking boxes with practiced efficiency. Social structure, tribal, with hierarchical tendencies. Technology level pre-interstellar with limited energy manipulation capability. Conflict resolution methodology, pending observation, though historical data suggested enthusiastic violence. The first simulation cycle initiated, introducing the environmental pressures that typically triggered species-wide meltdown. Water sources began showing signs of contamination in 3 regions. Agricultural yields decreased by 15% across all settlements. Mineral deposits essential for tool production became increasingly scarce, forcing communities to venture beyond their established territorial boundaries. Standard operating procedures suggested that subjects would respond to these pressures with territorial expansion, resource hoarding, and increasingly aggressive posturing toward neighboring communities. The assessor had witnessed this pattern countless times across dozens of species evaluations. Scarcity bred competition, competition bred conflict, and conflict bred the kind of spectacular civilizational collapse that made for straightforward paperwork. The humans, however, seemed determined to complicate her morning routine. Instead of immediately fortifying their borders and preparing for resource wars, several communities began sending emissaries to their neighbors. Not the typical posturing delegations designed to intimidate rivals into submission, but actual diplomatic missions apparently focused on information sharing. The assessor watched with growing puzzlement as humans from different settlements began comparing notes on water purification techniques and agricultural optimization strategies. This was irregular, though not unprecedented. Some species attempted cooperation during initial crisis periods before inevitably reverting to competitive behaviors when pressures intensified. She made note of the diplomatic contact frequency and waited for the inevitable breakdown when communities realized that collaboration meant sharing limited resources with potential competitors. The second simulation cycle introduced additional complications: a simulated plague affecting livestock, extreme weather patterns disrupting normal seasonal cycles, and equipment failures that would test each community's technological resilience. These escalating pressures had been calibrated to overwhelm even the most cooperative species, forcing them to prioritize their own survival over broader community welfare. The humans responded by establishing what appeared to be an inter-settlement communication network. The assessor paused her routine documentation to observe this development more closely. Rather than retreating into isolated defensive positions, the human communities were actively sharing information about plague containment, weather prediction patterns, and equipment repair techniques. They had somehow transformed individual crisis management into collaborative problem-solving exercises. More troubling still, they seemed to be enjoying themselves. Human gatherings in the simulation displayed behavioral patterns that suggested social bonding, rather than strategic planning. Their communication exchanges included non-essential elements that served no apparent survival function, shared meals, recreational activities, and what appeared to be competitive storytelling sessions. These behaviors indicated either remarkable stupidity or a fundamental misunderstanding of their situation's gravity. The third simulation cycle activated the territorial pressure protocols, introducing resource competition that should have triggered immediate conflictual responses. Communities with superior agricultural yields found themselves approached by neighbors experiencing crop failures. Standard assessment predictions suggested this would result in either violent resource seizure or defensive resource hoarding. Instead, the humans began implementing resource redistribution systems. The assessor stared at her monitoring displays, wondering if the simulation software had developed some kind of malfunction. Communities with surplus food supplies were voluntarily sharing with neighbors experiencing shortages, apparently operating under the assumption that mutual survival served everyone's long-term interest. This violated basic competitive principles that governed virtually every species the Bureau had previously evaluated. She ran a diagnostic check on the simulation parameters, confirming that all environmental pressures were functioning within normal operational ranges. The humans were experiencing identical stresses that had triggered predictable aggressive responses in hundreds of previous species assessments. Yet somehow they continued responding with increasingly sophisticated cooperative behaviors that seemed to strengthen rather than fragment their inter-community relationship. The fourth cycle introduced the final standard pressure test. Direct resource competition between communities with incompatible needs, mining rights, water access, and territorial boundaries became matters of immediate survival necessity. Historical data indicated that 97% of evaluated species responded to these pressures with organized violence within 2 simulation cycles. The humans organized a festival. Apparently they had decided that inter-community resource disputes could be resolved through competitive recreational activities, collaborative feast preparation, and what their communication networks described as getting to know each other better. The assessor watched in growing bewilderment as territorial negotiations became social gatherings, resource allocation became community planning sessions, and potential warfare became elaborate group problem-solving exercises. This was not how species evaluations were supposed to proceed. The simulation continued generating appropriate crisis scenarios, but the humans kept treating them as opportunities for enhanced cooperation, rather than justifications for competitive conflict. Their responses consistently fell outside the established parameters that defined successful Bureau assessment protocols. She glanced at her morning stimulant beverage, noting that it remained at optimal temperature, despite her prolonged observation session. The humans were systematically subverting every assumption underlying the standard evaluation framework, and she found herself genuinely curious about their next response to the simulation's escalating challenges. Perhaps this assessment would prove less routine than anticipated. Part 3. The Unexpected Turn. The fifth simulation cycle, launched with the kind of systematic precision that the Bureau had perfected over millennia of species evaluation. Environmental catastrophes cascaded across the holographic landscape. Volcanic eruptions disrupted 3 settlements. Massive storms flooded 2 coastal communities, and seismic activity threatened the structural integrity of 4 mining operations. These disasters had been calibrated to overwhelm any remaining cooperative impulses and force communities into desperate competition for survival resources. The assessor leaned forward in her chair, finally paying the simulation her complete attention. Surely this level of crisis would trigger the predictable behavioral patterns that justified her paperwork templates. Communities facing existential threats invariably prioritize their own survival over abstract concepts like intergroup cooperation. Basic evolutionary psychology demanded. The humans responded by implementing a disaster relief coordination system. Communities that remained unaffected by specific catastrophes immediately began mobilizing resources to assist their damaged neighbors. Engineering teams traveled between settlements sharing structural repair techniques. Agricultural specialists developed crop rotation strategies to compensate for lost farmland. Medical personnel established treatment protocols for disaster-related injuries that transcended individual community boundaries. The assessor's evaluation protocols had no categories for this type of response pattern. Her assessment forms contained detailed sections for documenting various forms of aggressive behavior, resource competition strategies, and territorial expansion methodology. They did not include provisions for voluntary resource sharing during crisis periods or collaborative disaster management techniques. She opened a new data file labeled Anomalous Behavioral Patterns
and began documenting observations that fell outside standard evaluation parameters. The humans were treating natural disasters as community-wide challenges rather than opportunities for competitive advantage. Their response networks demonstrated coordination capabilities that exceeded their apparent technological limitation. More concerning still, their collaborative efficiency was improving with each simulation cycle. The sixth cycle introduced technological scarcity pressures designed to trigger competitive innovation behaviors. Essential manufacturing equipment began failing across multiple settlements, forcing communities to choose between sharing repair knowledge or maintaining technological advantages over their neighbors. Historical evaluation data indicated that technological superiority typically became a primary source of inter-community conflict. The humans established what they called innovation workshops. Rather than hoarding technological knowledge for competitive advantage, communities began pooling their expertise to develop improved solutions for common problems. Failed equipment became opportunities for collaborative engineering projects. Resource limitations sparked creative problem-solving sessions that involved multiple settlements working toward shared technological advancement. The assessor watched in growing alarm as human communities that should have been competing for technological supremacy instead began accelerating each other's development through cooperative knowledge sharing. Their innovation rates were increasing exponentially, driven by collaborative research methodologies that distributed both costs and benefits across their entire network. This violated fundamental assumptions about technological development patterns. The Bureau's assessment protocols assumed that advanced technology required competitive pressure to drive innovation. Species that shared technological knowledge typically stagnated at mediocre development levels, lacking the competitive incentives necessary for breakthrough discovery. The humans were somehow achieving accelerated technological advancement through collaborative research, while simultaneously strengthening their inter-community social bonds. Their innovation workshops had evolved into what appeared to be recreational activities that produced practical technological solutions as incidental benefits. The seventh cycle activated the ultimate assessment protocol, direct existential competition. The simulation introduced a scenario where community survival required access to a single, non-renewable resource deposit. Only one settlement could claim the resource, forcing a zero-sum competition that eliminated possibilities for compromise or collaboration. Standard evaluation procedures predicted that this scenario would finally trigger the aggressive competitive behaviors that justified membership denial. Communities facing extinction-level threats inevitably abandoned cooperative pretenses in favor of survival-focused competition. The assessment had never encountered a species that maintained collaborative relationships when faced with genuine existential scarcity. The humans organized a resource-sharing conference. The assessor stared at her monitoring displays, wondering if she was experiencing some form of evaluation-induced psychological breakdown. The human communities had responded to ultimate scarcity by convening inter-settlement discussions about equitable resource distribution methodology. They were treating survival-level competition as an opportunity for enhanced cooperation. Their conference proceedings revealed decision-making processes that prioritized community-wide survival over individual settlement advantage. Communities with stronger claims to the resource voluntarily proposed sharing arrangements that ensured the survival of weaker neighbors. Settlements with superior extraction capabilities offered their services to communities lacking necessary technical expertise. The simulation's conflict generation algorithms began producing error messages. The assessment software had been designed to escalate competitive pressures until evaluated species demonstrated conclusive evidence of their suitability or unsuitability for Confederation membership. The program could not process response patterns that consistently transformed competitive scenarios into collaborative opportunity. Warning indicators began appearing across her evaluation interface. Parameter deviation beyond acceptable ranges, subject behavior falls outside assessment protocols, and simulation integrity compromised by anomalous response patterns. The humans had somehow managed to break the evaluation system through their refusal to behave according to established species development models. The assessor found herself facing an unprecedented situation in her 3 decades of evaluation experience. The simulation continued generating appropriate crisis scenarios, but the humans kept responding with increasingly sophisticated cooperative solutions that fell completely outside the Bureau's analytical framework. She activated emergency consultation protocols, requesting supervisory guidance for handling assessment anomalies. Her request triggered automated responses indicating that her supervisors were currently unavailable, engaged in extended bureaucratic planning sessions that would continue for several more standard time periods. The eighth simulation cycle attempted to compensate for previous anomalies by introducing multiple simultaneous crises, resource scarcity, territorial disputes, technological failures, natural disasters, and direct inter-community competition. The combined pressures exceeded anything in the Bureau's assessment archives, representing crisis levels that should have triggered immediate civilizational collapse. The humans responded by implementing what they called a community resilience network. Their response involved collaborative crisis management, shared resource pools, joint technological development, coordinated disaster relief, and cooperative competition methodologies that transformed every challenge into an opportunity for strengthened inter-community relations. They had essentially turned the entire assessment into a large-scale social bonding exercise. The assessor realized that she was no longer conducting a routine species evaluation. The humans had somehow transformed the assessment process itself, turning Bureau protocols into tools for demonstrating capabilities that transcended the evaluation framework's design parameters. Her morning stimulant beverage sat forgotten as she watched 12 human communities systematically subvert every assumption underlying galactic civilization assessment. They were not just passing the evaluation, they were redefining what successful evaluation performance could look like. The simulation continued running, but the assessor knew that standard assessment protocols no longer applied to whatever was happening in her evaluation chamber. Part 4: The results. The simulation concluded with the kind of anticlimactic finality that bureaucratic systems typically reserve for their most spectacular failures. Warning lights ceased flashing, error messages stopped cascading across monitoring displays, and the holographic human settlements faded back into digital nothingness. What remained was a comprehensive data record that would have made perfect sense to anyone who had never encountered actual human behavior. The assessor stared at results that challenged every fundamental assumption underlying galactic civilization theory. According to the final assessment metrics, the human communities had not only survived every crisis scenario, but had transformed each challenge into an opportunity for enhanced cooperation. Their resource distribution networks had evolved into self-sustaining abundance generation systems. Their conflict resolution methodologies had produced social structures that strengthened under pressure, rather than fragmenting. Most remarkably, they had somehow converted a competitive species evaluation into a collaborative civilization-building exercise. The standard assessment categories proved entirely inadequate for documenting their performance. Where the evaluation forms expected data on territorial expansion, the humans had created voluntary resource-sharing networks. Where metrics demanded evidence of technological competition, they had developed collaborative innovation systems. Where protocols required documentation of leadership hierarchies, they had established rotating governance structures that distributed authority based on expertise, rather than dominance. The humans had essentially treated the entire simulation as an extended social experiment in optimal community organization. The assessor attempted to compile her findings into a coherent report, discovering that the Bureau's evaluation framework contained no provisions for describing civilizations that consistently prioritized collective welfare over competitive advantage. Her assessment software kept generating error messages when she tried to input data that fell outside established behavioral categories. She faced a bureaucratic nightmare of unprecedented proportion. Standard rejection reports required evidence of species-level aggression, resource competition, or social fragmentation. Standard acceptance reports required demonstration of technological superiority, territorial expansion capabilities, or competitive dominance over environmental challenges. The humans had somehow achieved neither outcome, while simultaneously exceeding performance standards in categories that did not officially exist. Her evaluation protocols included no procedures for reporting that a species had accidentally optimized the assessment process itself. The morning stimulant beverage had grown cold during her extended observation period, though she barely noticed. 3 decades of routine evaluations had not prepared her for subjects who treated existential competition as collaborative problem-solving opportunity. The humans had approached every crisis scenario with the kind of creative adaptability that made bureaucratic categorization impossible. More troubling still, their solutions had consistently improved upon the simulation's original design parameters. Their resource distribution systems were more efficient than anything in the Bureau's databases. Their conflict resolution methodologies produced outcomes that benefited all participants rather than creating winners and losers. Their technological development had accelerated beyond what competitive pressure models predicted possible. The humans had not just passed the assessment, they had demonstrated that the assessment itself was inadequately designed to evaluate truly exceptional civilization. She reviewed the simulation records one final time, noting behavioral patterns that would have revolutionized galactic civilization theory if anyone bothered to analyze them seriously. The humans had consistently transformed zero-sum competitive scenarios into positive-sum collaborative opportunities. They had treated resource scarcity as innovation incentives rather than conflict triggers. They had approached every challenge with the assumption that collective solutions would produce superior outcomes to individual competition. Their performance suggested capabilities that transcended the evaluation framework's fundamental assumptions about civilization development patterns. The assessor realized that she faced an unprecedented decision. She could report the simulation as a malfunction, attributing the anomalous results to technical errors rather than genuine human capability. This would allow her to process the assessment through standard rejection protocols, maintaining bureaucratic efficiency, while ignoring evidence that challenged established evaluation methodologies. Alternatively, she could document the humans' actual performance, reporting that they had achieved outcomes that exceeded every established standard for species evaluation, while simultaneously revealing fundamental flaws in the assessment process itself. This option would trigger extended bureaucratic reviews, supervisory consultations, and possibly complete revision of evaluation protocols that had remained unchanged for millennia. The question that had seemed routine at the morning's beginning now carried implications that extended far beyond a single species assessment. The humans had not simply completed the evaluation, they had demonstrated that successful civilizations might operate according to principles that the Galactic Confederation had never considered. She looked at her evaluation terminal, cursor blinking expectantly in the final assessment field. The standard options appeared inadequate for documenting what had occurred during the simulation. Approved for membership implied that the humans met existing standards. Rejected for membership suggested they had failed to demonstrate necessary capability. Neither option acknowledged that they had essentially redefined what civilization assessment could accomplish. The morning's routine evaluation had evolved into a fundamental challenge to the Bureau's entire operational framework. The humans had approached the question, "Want me to run it now, or just show the results?" with the assumption that the assessment process itself could be improved through collaborative participation. They had been correct. The assessor began typing her report, realizing that the real evaluation had not been of humanity's suitability for joining galactic civilization. Instead, the humans had inadvertently assessed whether galactic civilization was sophisticated enough to recognize genuinely exceptional species when they encountered them.
The results, she suspected, would prove far more revealing than anyone had anticipated when the morning's routine paperwork began. After 3 decades of predictable evaluations, she finally understood why the Bureau's assessment protocols had remained unchanged for so long. They had never encountered a species creative enough to improve them. Perhaps it was time for the Galactic Confederation to learn something new.